Um, yeah, so I'm very thankful to have another opportunity for us with this webinar series that the Gideon Institute of Christian Psychology and Counseling has been putting on, to have a second opportunity with Paul Vitz. I wanted to welcome those that could join us, as well as those that will be watching the recording as you have opportunity. I feel constrained, however, before I begin this interview, to mention that I am in the home of a friend of Paul's and a longtime friend of myself named Werner Mai, his wife Agnes, both of them dear friends of my wife and I. We are visiting them in Germany for a couple of weeks. This is maybe the 6th time we've had the opportunity to visit with them. I'm not going to introduce them to you today, though they're somewhere off in their house, but we're going to have them do a webinar with them. Werner was a founder of IGNIS, the Institute for Christian Psychology in Germany, that's been around over 30 years, close to 35 years. And I really want our audience and constituency to find out more about their amazing contributions in Germany. But we have plenty to talk about this evening with Paul. So I thought what we might do is I would just kind of summarize what we talked about last month. And that was that you had a career for many decades at New York University, and became most well known, I think, to evangelicals because of your book, Psychology as Religion, The Cult of Self-Worship, which we have talked about. And then another very important book that came out in late 80s, Sigmund Freud's Christian Unconscious, which is a fantastic contribution to the literature on Sigmund Freud. You did some original research there, and we had opportunity to talk through those books and some other things that you have done in that part of your career. So today, what I thought would be fascinating and wonderful would be for you to maybe pick up with what led to a transition in your career, leaving New York University, and then starting up with what used to be called the Institute for the Psychological Sciences, now Divine Mercy University. And then we're going to spend a good chunk of time talking about I think, the most important work of your career, in my opinion, my humble opinion, that I'd like us to spend some time on, the meta model, talking about the meta model that you and your colleagues there have worked on. So would you walk us through the transition in your maybe 2 stages of your career?
Well, I was at NYU, as you know, for many years, and we raised our family there. My wife, Timmy, was also a professor at NYU. She was a professor in the French department. She was a medievalist, French medievalist at NYU. But around 1990, I was asked to come down to Washington to something just called the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family. It was a Catholic attempt to, and still operating, to develop a support for marriage and family. And I went down there, and they were almost all philosophers and theologians, and they needed a reality check. And I was a psychologist, and so I gave them some of the negatives, and not that the family was to be thought of negatively, but there was a lot of problems in the family. And I gave them some of the psychological data on the problems of the family. I then discussed what the secular response had been to those problems, and then proposed what a Christian response should be to the problems. And I taught that course from around 1990 to around the year 2000. But at that time, I would go down to Washington. I'd fly down just for the day, teach that course. And but I met a lot of people down there in the Washington area. And I met 2 Catholic Christian psychologists there. And they said they wanted to set up something where the Institute for Psychological Sciences, where we would give, credit. All of you, once you get your degree, you have to continue to get continuing education credits. So we thought we would provide lecture material for how to become a serious Christian therapist to those who'd all been trained as secularists. So we started with that. And then Gladys Sweeney, I think the Holy Spirit put a bug in her head or something like that. She said, no, let's not just give CE credits. Let's set up our own institution and our own graduate program. And she was very energetic and very sweet, and she knew how to talk to men and get money out of them. And that was with the help of the Holy Spirit. She got money to found the Institute for Psychological Sciences. And I helped provide the curriculum and the material for that and the rationale for it. And another colleague, Bill Nordling, was extremely important in terms of his clinical experience and in terms of his administrative capacities. So we set it up. And I worked there just part-time for a while. And then I said, I'm tired of NYU. Now I'm here, and I said, I'm going to retire and get a sabbatical leave of a semester as part of my retirement. They wanted to get rid of us oldies. I was about 65 then. And so I did. I retired from NYU and went full-time at IPS. I remember I taught the first course that they had back around the year 2000. And we had some students who came on board. They were very risk-taking students. Why? Because we weren't even accredited yet by the state, much less by the whole, the top level. But they came on anyway, and some of them, the very best students we ever had were those risk takers early on. And so then I decided, as I said, to resign. Now, people said I was crazy to resign a tenured lifetime professorship at NYU with no retirement age to join this fly-by-night, just starting IPS. It didn't bother me. I knew I was supposed to do it. And so I had very little anxiety. And I enjoyed doing it from the start. And somehow or other, the money came from the board. It was all, donors and things like that. There was no, and some tuition, but the tuition doesn't pay much of graduate education. And so we started it, and it was fun and interesting, and I could teach what I really believed to students who were really believers. It was an enormous freedom from NYU. And so I had no doubt, I never looked back. And some years later, my wife, we moved down to Northern Virginia, and first in Arlington, where we had rented, where the IPS rented its space. And now IPS is called Divine Mercy University because it has two other graduate programs, master's degree programs, and has moved out to Sterling, Virginia, and so have we. So it's not as, romantic as it might seem. It was, I felt it was just, I was called there. I felt confident in some sense that God wanted me there. And I never looked back.
Well, so you have a PhD program there then. I think that was what Gladys Sweeney was.
Yes, it's a not PhD, it's a Doctor of Psychology.
Okay,
it's a doctoral program, and that's to train clinical psychologists from the beginning, from the get-go, from a Christian Catholic perspective. Yeah. And there was nothing like it in the psychological world for Catholics, but at the time there were a good number of Protestant programs, and there still are. And they were our models, as I mentioned to you earlier. They gave us hope that we could do the same thing for Catholics. And they often gave us good advice. We hired them as consultants and things like that. These were people, they were people at Liberty University. There were people at Rosemead, Biola, and people at, I think Fox. I forget where all of them were at the time. Some of them have come into existence since we started 20 years ago. But the evangelical Protestant programs were sort of not only our initial model, but they gave us a lot of good advice and support.
And it's APA accredited,
It is now APA accredited. And again, I think some of the people on the APA board were from those Protestant programs. And so they knew what this was all about, and they were friendly and supportive.
Well, through
So
the
I'd like to thank you all.
Yeah. Well, and as I said to you, I think now you've returned the favor by coming out with this book. I'm going to just show the cover of this book. The title is A Catholic Christian Meta Model of the Person, Integration with Psychology and Mental Health Practice. I think it's over 800 pages. And this is your life's work, I would suppose, along with the other editors,
Nordling
and Craig Titus, and other faculty there who contributed.
Yes, it's a joint contribution.
Yes, but I think it's fair to say that you probably spearheaded this project, have been working on it your whole career, and especially the last 20 years. So I would just enjoy having you kind of share what you see as some of the highlights. If I could just mention what stands out to me that makes this a singular contribution. Well, let me first say, I'm aware of only two distinctly Christian models of psychotherapy that, to my mind, can hold their own at a conceptual level of sophistication with other models out there, like dialectical behavior therapy or motivational interviewing, where there's been a lot of work developing the model. So it really kind of stands on its own. One by Joshua Knabb, and then this one. So for me, it's outstanding. And what makes it so important, I think, for the Christian community is that the way that you begin in, I think it's the second chapter, where you lay out your premises. There are theological, philosophical, and psychological premises, all of which are foundational to what it is that you're doing. And Paul, I don't know if you know how unique that is, but that's there. I don't know of any other institution that's kind of dedicated itself to this kind of foundational work that is nevertheless a clinical model for working in therapy. So why did you work on this project, if I can begin?
Well, it just seemed this was needed. And so as we wanted to develop our own approach, this seemed to develop on its own with lots of other people criticizing or supporting. I would like to say this about the model. It's not it's not primarily a theory of psychotherapy. It's a framework for understanding the person. And we will accept within that framework any other model of psychotherapy or counseling with two caveats. One, it has to have evidence supporting its utility. In other words, evidence-based support, which the APA requires as well. And second, if it has any philosophical or other assumptions that are anti-Christian, we put those aside. For example, Albert Ellis, who invented or was one of the major developers of cognitive behavioral therapy, was a very ardent, active, insulting atheist. But his work was very important and positive. And so we can accept cognitive behavioral therapy as it is practiced without his comments about how dumb believers are. Because that's not part of the assumption of the model. And if it were part of the assumption, we couldn't take it, but there's no basic model. You can be a psychoanalyst, a neo-psychoanalyst, in spite of Freud and his assumptions. You can be any, we put aside anti-Christian assumptions, and usually they're not even very relevant to the actual practice of psychotherapy. So we can accept them under this umbrella of our framework. But in addition to our framework, we also argue other things have to be added on to understanding the person. And those are the theological aspect of the person must be seen as part of the total person. Second, the philosophical assumptions that the person makes must also be seen. And any theory of psychotherapy actually has these assumptions, we found out when you look at them closely. And they don't tell you about them, or they seem unaware of them, and they never defend them. So what we say to the other theories out there now, you better tell us what your theological assumptions are. You better tell us what your philosophical assumptions are, as well as your psychological theory. So that's what we're trying to do, is to bring attention to philosophical and theological aspects of existing theories. And you might say, what theories have theological aspects? And I would say, well, if you think self-actualization is the meaning of life, you have a final theological framework. If you're a narrative therapist and you talk about a person at the end of therapy, you reconstituted the story of their life, and those people who are narrative therapists argue that a good therapy ends up with a story that is a redemptive story. They use that very word, a redemptive narrative, for the conclusion of narrative therapy. So, and of course, if you're a positive psychologist, maybe your redemption is flourishing through the virtues. With Jung, it was self-realization. As I said, with Rogers, it was self-actualization. So those are the redemptive aspects of existing secular theories that need to be identified as such. Meanwhile, they all more or less accept that we're fallen. They don't want to use the term fallen, it's too theological, but that if people didn't naturally have lots of problems, there wouldn't even be a discipline of psychology. It's our job to fix them. And so the first three theological and only theological premises of the model are: we were created by God in the image of God. Therefore, every human being has dignity and importance. Second, but we're fallen. And third, we're redeemed through Jesus. So the basic theological assumptions of the model are very basic Christianity. But they give us, for example, with that first assumption that we were created by God in the image of God, they give us a reason for valuing what we're doing and for not saying anybody is unworthy. We don't say anyone is unworthy of our help or unworthy of anyone's help. Freud did. He said a lot of people aren't worthy of psychotherapy or of anything else. But we have a rationale for why. So those are our three theological assumptions. If you're an evolutionary psychologist, we're just the result of random evolution, so I'm not sure why anybody has much dignity. I mean, we're just another animal. But anyway, we were created by God in the image of God, and also he created us male and female, and he said it was good. Okay? That's a big poke in the eye to the transsexuals today. Anyway, then we go to our philosophical assumptions, which are also rational and supported by psychology. We have, and there, most of them would be very compatible with any general theory of psychology, but two of them are different. And they are add-ons that enrich our understanding of the person, just like bringing in the theological and philosophical enlarges the model of the person. These two premises enlarge the notion of the person, even though we all know about them, but we never bring them into psychology very much. One of those is every person has a vocation. Every person has a calling. In fact, we say every person has three callings. You have the calling to individual development, whether you're secular or religious. As Christians, we're called to the spiritual development as a Christian. But in the secular world, you might be called to self-actualization, or at least to some higher meaning. Not that I, accept it, but that would be the analog. We have a personal vocation. We have an interpersonal vocation, usually to a state of life, like to being married, or some people now are called, they say, to the state of life of being single. and others are called to the state of life of being consecrated to a religious life of some kind. So everybody has that, everybody has that vocation one way or the other. And finally, we all have a vocation to work, to a contribution to society. It doesn't necessarily mean paid work. We all have, most of the earth students will be psychotherapists or counselors. That's their social vocation. But we think that's part of the person that's very important. It's foundational and should be taken into account, not with every patient, but it should be always present in case it's going to be relevant to a given patient. And a second dimension that we add that's important are the virtues. And we say it's time to look at patients, not just in terms of the problems, the weaknesses they have, but look at their strengths and how the strengths can be further strengthened. And those strengths would be the virtues. And here we're in complete agreement, mostly with the positive psychologists and people like Seligman, that a very important answer to life is to flourish through the virtues. But so far, the virtues have not been integrated very effectively into psychotherapy per se. Anyway, so that's a little sketch of the framework. And within it, you can be a psychoanalyst, you can be a cognitive behaviorist, you can be an interpersonal or emotion-focused therapist, but you add the framework to bring in the theological implications of the person you're dealing with, as well as these, as their vocation and their virtues. So that's a brief sketch of it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That was terrific summary. And gee, I'm being educated very much. I have not yet read the book myself. I've just kind of gone through some sections of it. I just received it this last semester, but I look forward to going through it and using it as a textbook in our program at the Gideon Institute. But yeah, you surprised me. But then when you said it's not a model, and then it dawned on me, well, yeah, it's a meta model. That's why you called it a meta model.
Yeah, it's not on the same conceptual level as another theory of psychotherapy. It's a way of incorporating the best of the existing therapists, plus adding enrichment by adding theological concerns with the person, philosophical concerns, and those particular two other ones, which are all teleological, that is the virtues and the vocation.
Yeah. So yeah, just what you've said. Well, let's see what Paul, Charles, what are you saying there? Can you read that, Paul?
I read it. He wants me to say some more about it, but I don't know quite what to say that hasn't been said and he would like to hear about.
Just talk.
Is there a particular topic?
Yeah, Charles, you want to just jump in?
I can do that. So yeah, I'm currently in the middle of reading the meta model book, and I'm just loving it. The presentation of this basic framework is exactly the kind of scholarship that we need. And so, you talk about creation, about fall, redemption, but vocation comes in there as something that seems to be presented as equally important to understanding what it means to be human. So could you tell us a little bit more about why vocation is so central to the meta model?
I'm trying to get something happen. There, all right, now I'm back on the screen. Vocation is so important because, look, almost all your clients, particularly young people, the issue of whether they're going to get married or not is often a very big and important issue in the whole understanding of that person. They're wondering about it. Second, if they are married, they have a vocation to marriage, and that means that has to fit into your model of the case history or the case construction. You have to know how that is working. You know, is the spouse there a helper or a hinderer in the problems that you're dealing with? And maybe you have to confront their vocation and meaning of the marriage before you can address the individual issue that they're bringing to you. It's just a very important thing to always be aware of. The person is not just a singleton. Normally, they have commitments. They have a vocation often to a spouse or to children. So that's why we want you always to be aware that that's something to note with your patient. It may not be relevant. If you're dealing with a 12-year-old boy, he's probably not too concerned about getting married. And he doesn't necessarily have any children. So that isn't an issue. But you would probably want to deal with his relationship to his own parents as part of his vocation as a child, in a sense, to being part of the family. So that's why we bring it in. It may not always be relevant, but we want you to be, just like sometimes the theological won't be relevant, or the created won't be relevant. But we want you to have these things as present as you think about the person, so that although you may have to sort of drill down on one or two major points, always keep these others in mind, because they're present in the person and they may interact with the problem you're dealing with. I hope I've made myself clear.
And I promise we're going to have some time for questions so that others can.
That's
can,
great.
That's
ask.
Yeah, we're going to definitely do that. I also, before we finish though, just kind of summarizing the book, because I thought that would be a helpful part of it. I noticed that in the last chapters of the book, you do get very practical. It may not be a full-blown model, but you do your best to try and show its relevance to topics like case conceptualization,
Yes,
group psychotherapy, enriching DSM diagnosis by, I'm assuming, including some of considerations about virtue and vice, psychological assessment, and a chapter on social psychology. So I think there's, that's going to be really wonderful, I think, for those of us that teach in those areas, that want to learn more about a Christian.
that's where the
approach
rubber
in
of the
those
model
areas.
hits the road.
Yeah, yeah. So that will be quite helpful. So maybe just if I could begin a little bit of conversation on that, on the notion of a meta model. It's like, it seems obvious now that you've said it, that it is just a meta model, and yet it's because you're dealing with the theology and philosophy as well as the psychology of psychotherapy. It's far-reaching. It has far-reaching implications for all models. And a question that I'm going to be thinking about now for the future is the degree to which your framework, this Divine Mercies framework, will of necessity lead to a transformation of other models. Almost of necessity, because it's what you're doing is so radical, in my opinion. Whereas, the other models that are out there in, shall we say, the secular world, their worldview assumptions are embedded implicitly in their models. And they're, as you said earlier, they're typically not aware of that. And so they tend not to talk about these things, by contrast, as much as you have done. But I think it's extremely formative in what, the implications of what you've done. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it certainly does. And this is one of the things we'd like to do, is to challenge those other positions to develop their own meta interpretation. You could make one of I think I mentioned to him that there's a professor at Harvard who's Jewish named David Rosmarin, and he likes the model too. But of course, he probably wouldn't go for the redemption in Jesus as the answer, but he would go to redemption to God through the Jewish understanding of God. But there would be redemption. And he's become an important person at Harvard, because he's found in cognitive and behavioral therapy that when he works with his Jewish patients, when he brings in the Jewishness of them, they get better much faster. That is, when he brings in the theological issues and the theological way of understanding their life, they move more quickly through the therapy. So maybe even Harvard is waking up, you know what I mean? But there could be other meta models now that you mentioned that. So we're not saying this is the only possible meta model. It's pretty Christian and not especially Catholic, but the Catholic part is in the philosophy more than the theology. Most of the philosophy is realist philosophy a la Aquinas, or personalist philosophy a la John Paul II. I don't think that most Protestants would be put off by it, but if they are, you can always, adapt something to your own framework, but a meta model is what's going to be needed these days, I think, for anyone.
Yeah.
So we hope they follow that example, at least in the meta model sense.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Paul. That you've given us so much to think about this evening. One of the themes that you touched on that's in the book, there's a whole chapter on sex and gender relations, man and woman, that seems so important, particularly in our day. And after our last talk, or somehow related to our last talk, I discovered that you edited recently a book on the complementarity of women and men. I think it's philosophy, theology, psychology, and art, something like that was
That's
the
right.
subtitle.
That's the subtitle. You got it.
Yeah, so this is obviously a very important part of a Christian view of human beings. Could you share with us some of what this work that you've been doing more recently than this book? And then I think I'll open it up to those that are present for some Q&A with you. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's what it is. It's a book on the complementarity of women and men. It has 5 chapters, 3 by women and 2 by men. That's the number of authors who contribute. The basic premise is this. Look, in the modern world, there are 2 secular approaches. Either men and women are the same, except for trivial differences, like plumbing or something like that. Or there are significant differences and one sex is superior. Those are the major models that are out there potentially. Historically, there's been a lot of emphasis on men as superior, but now the radical feminists are saying women are superior. So in other words, there are differences, but one sex is superior versus there's no difference, and so they're all equal. Well, the Christian position is in between, and it solves these 2 dilemmas. We say there are significant differences, and that's because that's the truth. That's what you find observing reality is about. Every culture makes a distinction between men and women that the anthropologists have ever found. They're different, or they have significant differences. But we argue that as both of them are made in the image of God, and they were created by God, therefore they are of equal dignity. So they're equal in their dignity, but different in their bodies. Not completely different, but different. And that follows out of Christian theology, just very basic. So it solves the problem of one sex being superior, and it solves which is a moral dilemma that we reject. And it solves the problem of saying there aren't any differences, which is the whole problem of truth and observational factitude. So that's what the model of the person is in that complementarity. And the arguments are presented sometimes theologically, sometimes philosophically. I present psychology and neuroscience. Elizabeth Lebb presents some wonderful stuff from the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. In other words, Michelangelo believed in the complementarity, and it shows up in his paintings in some interesting ways that hadn't been noticed before. And in the Sistine Chapel, which some people would say is the most patriarchal place in the world, because that's where the cardinals decide on who people. And yet there's Michelangelo. You have to read her chapter. It's great. And then Sister Mary Prudence Allen has a wonderful one, a nice chapter on criticizing radical feminism and how goofy they got. And Dr. Deborah Savage has a very nice integration of theology and philosophy on complementarity, where she talks about the genius of women and the genius of men and the differences of those two geniuses, if you will, but how they're complementary. And the thing about being complementary is this, and this idea first was given to me by Sister Prudence Allen. The complementarity, when they work together positively, have a synergy. They create something greater than either sex by itself could create. And of course, the best examples of that most commonly are a child and a family. And that notion of synergy, it's as though you put two men, if a man and a woman each have 10 units of goodness, you put them together and in a positive way, they come out with 100 units, they multiply. That's synergistic. If you have them isolated, two men is just 10 plus 10, two women, 10 plus 10. Put them together, they multiply in a synergistic way. They create something positive. Now, that's not always the case, of course. Men and women irritate each other a good deal, and sometimes worse than that. So it can be not positive, but at its best, it has created a dim copy of the Holy Family, of a family where it's one man, one woman, and children that they're both devoted to. And that's synergy. Now, you don't have to get married, of course. As a Catholic, I'd say, but then you have to have spiritual children. But so that's what the complementarity book is about. I document a lot of the psychological differences and some of the neuroscience differences. Apparently, almost every organ in the body is different between males and females, slightly. So that when women get heart attacks, they get it in a very different way than men get heart attacks, because women's hearts are different. But, that's the essence of that book. Complementarity gives rise in its best moments to synergy. And that as Christians, we believe in the equal dignity of men and women because the two together express the image of God. But the real problem is this today, and this is the big problem. Today, the secular world is saying there is no human nature of any kind, because we're going to manipulate it through genetics, through hormones. And in the transhumanist movement, they're going to create a totally non-biological form of human beings. And that's the big challenge, I think. We were made by God in the image of God, and we were embodied. Another word for embodiment is we were incarnate. And those who are trying to get to unincarnate us, that is to get rid of our body, are doing the work of Satan. Pretty strong thing to say. But the transhumanists want to reduce us to some kind of computer program in some kind of non-bodily existence. So we have to be very, very aware of that. They want to say there is nothing in human nature which is stable. If there is, we can then change it. So that's the big challenge in the future. God help us.
Yeah. There's a lot, so much going on in our culture right now, showing a kind of mass confusion. I think about issues that are in some way natural law, that are a part of our Constitution, that the Christian tradition and most traditions up until recently have assumed. This book, I think, is really timely. I don't know anything quite like it, and I'm looking forward to getting it. So thank you, Paul, for that. And when we finish up, I'm going to make a few more concluding remarks about your work, but I'd like to open it up to anybody who has a question for Paul.
Charles again? I can see him here on the screen anyway. Anyone who does.
I don't know, what's on my mind right now was just appreciation for the description of the book that's just come out. While you were describing it, I opened up another tab and found it so I can order my copy.
That means I make an extra, I think I make an extra 12.5 cents. However, one thing I am doing, I might mention, and I'll just say it in a few words. Right now, I'm working on the analog coding and digital coding, and what are the psychological consequences of it. If anybody else is interested in that, because I think digital coding is getting out of control these days. It's turning into the sorcerer's apprentice. So I have a critique of digitalism, not a total rejection, of course, by any means, but critique of it.
It seems like I made a comment that vocation and complementarity would interact in important ways when we're working with real humans. That how the genders, men and women, understand vocation, experience and enact and receive vocation, sort of the flavor of that would be different. And so you're going to see that a bit differently when you work with, I see that in young men versus with women in particular, and then in midlife men, particularly in a rural environment in which I operate. That idea of vocation sort of is experienced differently in the genders. Is that consistent with what you work with in the meta model, Dr. Vitz?
It's not only consistent. If you would write it up and publish it, we'd love to. We'd love to reference it as a kind of support. It's exactly the insight that we're delighted that you have, because in fact, it's special relevance perhaps for more rural couples. I'm sure we had no clue to that. And but when you say it, it becomes immediately clear that it would be. And so I'd say, write it up.
Yeah, well, it's Eric has wanted me to write some of this stuff for a while, so sorry, Eric. It's in the rural areas, Houston, we have a problem. And, one of your largest cohorts of self-destruction is middle-aged rural men. And one of the things that's crucial, I was working with somebody, or talked with someone this morning on neurobiology of relationships and the importance of clan relationships in being human. And, psychology, mental health people emphasize clan relationships like not at all.
That's right. And that's right, not at all.
And it's massively important for understanding a lot of what happens in the postmodern era, and understanding the differences between rural practice and urban practice, almost to the point where, I question the competence of urban practicing people at all, because of dynamics of clan relationships and how complementarity plays out in that as co-varying with vocation. Just as a simple example of that, okay? Boundaries between work and family. Are you serious? You're going to do it with a family farm? So I think that a meta model like yours would be a nice way of really talking about these issues.
2 thumbs up, sir. 2 thumbs up. Look, it warms my heart to hear you speak this way. And you've got it. And because it brings in the whole notion of vocation and what kind of social commitment, both to family and to clan, the whole notion of clan. Now, I will say this about the model. It's a little bit weak in one important area, which needs to be brought in. In the model, we go from the top, theology, then philosophy. We go from philosophy to psychology. Actually, in between philosophy and psychology should be culture and sociology.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's where, that would be the best place to put clan.
Right.
But in any case, it's there for interpersonal significance, and you should include it. It would be completely compatible with the model, and a modest, potentially a modest expansion of the model, as well as a very interesting support and expansion of it.
Yeah, this is where Eric might bring in his friend Werner May, because the Europeans have done a good job in thinking in terms of collective psychology and anthropology, and their online journal really reflects that. Wouldn't you agree with that, Eric?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This is the whole notion of things like solidarity and other, and of Adler's social interest, Gemeinschaftsgefühl. And that's where Europe is ahead of us on understanding the social and, clan and social significance of things.
Well, I would think that some of us might have some more questions. Anybody else want to ask Paul something about what he's talked about this time, or in other parts of his career?
We'll say this, we've had 6 children, and that's a big time consumer. Don't kid yourself. And we now have 23 grandchildren. And that's a big time consumer too, strangely enough, in your grandparent stage. We have to write more about grandparents. I saw an interesting article about grandmothers saying the reason that women, female humans cease being fertile about the age roughly of 45 to 50. And no, that's not true of any other primate, is because is partly because being a young mother is very, very helpful as being compared to being an older mother. And second, it allows the role of the grandmother to develop. And that the grandmother role may be a very important one in family survival and in family richness. And there's a secondary one for grandfathers too, but I think the grandmother is probably crucial. So anyone who wants to write about grandmothers and grandfathers, that would be an important contribution, I think, just to psychology, period.
Yeah, that's all that's so rich. I mean, I'm aware that in our counseling program, we have a required course on vocational counseling, but that's seen as sort of a specialty area.
Yes.
And what you're suggesting, which just makes so much psychological sense, is that vocation is intrinsic to every, at least adult life, and ought to be seen as more central to what we talk about in therapy, rather than kind of an isolated, maybe just a soul that's having problems that we talk with in session.
Yes, because it's seen almost like a special kind of expertise to be put in high school.
Yeah.
Help you find your job. But in fact, your total vocation to what kind of work you have. And by the way, this is relevant to the psychotherapist and counselor themselves. Their role, has a vocational meaning to it. I mean, I assume everybody, a Christian counselor or a Christian therapist, that's a vocation that they're exploring in their own life. So that's relevant to self-care and all of that type of thing too.
Dr. Vitz, I have a question for you. Rich Kozart from Houston and HBU. Just a question about your own personal disciplines as an academic, as a writer, as a thinker. Obviously, we all kind of sit back and look at all that you've produced. And how do you do that? Your personal disciplines in terms of research, writing, that kind of thing. I just appreciate your thoughts about that.
Well, you have, the crucial thing is to have time. And strangely enough, when I was in academia, we lived in New York City, and we lived on the 23rd floor of a high-rise building that was within walking distance of NYU and of the schools that the children went to. So I saved 40 hours a week by not commuting. I saved another 40 hours a week by not having to work on the house or the yard. And I saved another 40 hours a week by not having any television. So in other words, I'm not saying that's the answer for everybody by any means, but you need to find some time. You really do. And then you will discover that each person seems to have a different way of writing or thinking or doing things. So you need to find it. And I think prayer is an important preparation for it and for being at peace, even when nothing seems to happen. About all I can say. I'm no real expert on it. It just happened the way it did in my own life.
Thank you.
One other topic I'll just bring up briefly. I guess we're getting near the end, aren't we? Yeah. I've just finished an article that's in the press in Journal of Psychology and Christianity. That's the CAPS journal. And it's on a new way of understanding the soul in psychology. A new way of understanding the soul in a way that's consistent with traditional philosophical understandings. And that is part of my general way problem. I think a lot about things related to the soul and the mind. And I've also have an interpretation or a model of the origin of human consciousness. And now I actually think the true origin of it is from God, but what happened is what I try to describe. So for what it's worth, if people have an interest in human consciousness, it's a special topic that some people care about. I've been also a critic at one time of self-forgiveness, and I've been criticized in return by everybody who believes in self-forgiveness, which is most everybody. So I have published a critique of it, arguing instead for self-acceptance and self-compassion rather than self-forgiveness. But I could easily be wrong on this because a lot of my dear colleagues say I'm wrong. So you can decide. I think maybe the big issue is how far does self-forgiveness go? Could Hitler forgive himself? Because in general, we understand that forgiveness either comes from an independent other person or from God. So how far can the self do it?
Dr. Vitz, I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
I'm curious about, I've been thinking about kind of some of our discussion about vocation and about, how that plays into family structure and clan and those types of things. And working in Houston, Texas, I've worked with a lot of families who there's a strong number of refugees who their family structure and vocation and different things are disrupted by war, disrupted by immigration, family separation for years, and sudden reunifications, or through deportations, unplanned separations again, a lot of disruptions to these structures.
Right.
And I could certainly see this model kind of working, because I know I work with a lot of families who don't even have a notion that these structures even should be there for their children. And so I'd be curious if even in past research, I'm sure just over the years, this is not, this side of heaven, it's not the first time that people have been displaced by war, the first time we've had refugees, the first time that these things have happened, how this might fit into working with families that are struggling with those different types of separations and disconnectedness and different things that impact them on a daily basis, spiritually and emotionally and psychologically.
Well, first, I don't know very much about this, so I'll do my best to give some kind of response. I'm sure there is some literature on this, which would be a very worthwhile project just to get it together and give a review of it. But I think what I would say to families like this is that you can't control, neither they nor you can control what's going to happen in the splitting of it up. But you should mention how that it is important to keep in touch as best they can and make it part of the counseling, that you check on whether they do relate to the people who are part of their family. And the second thing is this: they need a new, larger family. And the best place for that is the church.
Right.
And I knew they were Baptists. I just happened to know about them. And they were actually Baptists from someplace in Central America. They had immigrated here, and they felt all alone because their real families were dispersed or still back in Central America. And when they went to the Baptist church, there they found what they needed. And so one of the ways in which you address the problem of the disintegration of the natural family is to try to develop the integration of a spiritual or religious family. And that means you encourage many of them, it's very natural for them to go to church. I mean, it isn't like you're not forcing anything on them. But they all said, oh, we always used to go to church in Central America or something, but now I'm up here. So I would argue that the church is one place for them to gain a restructure of the social environment for them. And that'll be very helpful, especially for mothers who want to find out what to do with their children up here.
I think that also kind of leads to another vocation just amongst us within the body of Christ, like within church communities, like you said, to create that emotional family, to create these structures, to the restructure again, and how we need to be present for that recreation of community and to be a part of that, how that is part of our Christian vocation.
Yes.
That's part of our called vocation as Christians, is to be that community for each other within the body of Christ, and how vital that is.
Absolutely. And that means sometimes going to their houses and helping, for men to go to their houses and help put on a new roof or repair the window, and for women to go to those houses and to work with the women in the kitchen or whatever they do, or take over babysitting sometimes when she has to go to the hospital or something.
Yeah. Surrogate
in other words-
grandparents.
Yeah.
You need grandparents too. We had Grandparents' Day, and we had children there from other countries who didn't have grandparents. So volunteers from our church would come and be the grandparents for them.
Well, look, there's
Yeah.
there's the answer to your dilemma right there, or part of the answer. Well done.
Thank you. I can
Well,
see your
we're
model
almost-
working well with that, though.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us these 2 hours. We didn't have enough time. I think what we're going to try and do is post a copy of your CV that lists all of your works, as well
Okay.
as the ones that you mentioned just now that you're working on right now. I think there were like 3 or 4 articles that you're working on right now that I think probably some of the audience would like to be aware of and track down those references. So thanks so much, Paul, for joining us. You're
Look,
terrific.
I really
You're always
enjoyed it.
great.
You people are wonderful, and it's, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be able to talk to you and know you, Eric, and to have any contact at all with your students seems to, for me, it's been an eye-opening pleasure.
Terrific.